Chapter 8. How? Pain. That was all I could feel as my senses slowly returned. My ears rang. Everything was dark. I tried to open my eyes, but the effort sent a wave of agony through me. I coughed, a wet and rattling sound, feeling blood rise in my throat. A hand pressed firmly against my chest. The pain gradually gave way to a strange tingle in my lungs, like frost melting from within. Slow, aching, alive. Breath returned in shallow gasps, each one sharper than the last. When my eyes finally fluttered open, I saw Keenan kneeling over me, his hand glowing faintly as he slowly healed my wounds. "Take it easy," he said, helping me into a sitting position. Rieger sat nearby, his face streaked with dirt, cuts, and bruises. We all looked awful, battered, bloodied, and coated in debris. I glanced down to see bruises spreading across my chest and legs through the tears in my clothes. "What happened?" I asked weakly, trying to stand. Keenan and Rieger exchanged glances before helping me to my feet. As they stepped aside, the room came into focus, and the sight before me stole my breath from my lungs. Narathor was frozen solid. His face was locked in an expression of pure terror, arms raised as if he was trying to shield himself. His eyes, wide, glassy, were fixed on a point 15 feet above the floor, near the door. The space before him was coated in thick ice, jagged icicles erupting from his back as if he'd been struck by an impossibly powerful freezing force. The temperature had dropped sharply. I shivered as I looked around, breath misting in the air. Behind us, the doors remained shut. We had collapsed directly in front of them. Whoever opened them would have had to push us aside. The third portal was sealed, its orb locked from the pedestal, and lying dark on the floor like a dead star. "How?" I whispered. "Who could have done this?" I looked at Keenan. He shook his head, his expression grim. "It wasn't me. Even if I had the power, something like that would require an unimaginable amount of energy." I turned to Rieger. He met my gaze with something I'd never seen in him before. Fear, real fear, and uncertainty. Quietly he said, "The elves, we can't do this." I stretched, wincing as pain flared through me. Keenan had healed the worst of it, but I still felt like I'd been tossed around like a rag doll. "We should be dead," Keenan murmured, staring at the massive frozen demon. I followed his gaze. I remembered Narathor's hatred, how he'd looked at us like we were insects beneath his heel. Now his eyes were locked in a mask of fear, the worst I'd ever seen. It wasn't just death that had claimed him, it was something older, something powerful. "Did you see anything?" I asked. Rieger shook his head. "No, I hit the wall and blacked out. When I came to, you and Keenan were still out cold. I crawled to him, woke him up, and he healed both of us, then we got to you." I scanned the room, confused. "Is there any other way in or out?" "I don't think so," Rieger said, coughing, a trace of blood on his lips. "Then someone must have portaled in," I said. "We need to tell my uncles, immediately. This is serious." I shook my head, mumbling, "We should be dead." "Agreed," Keenan said, slowly shaking his head in disbelief. The three of us pulled open the large doors and stepped into the hallway, every movement slow and cautious as we tried to process what had just happened. As we walked, the soreness in our bodies gradually faded, letting us pick up the pace. We still didn't know how to leave the area, or even what time it was. The silence of the corridor pressed in around us, heavy and strange. Retracing our steps, we finally came across Frank. We gave him a vague explanation, telling him that some bad guys had attacked and killed everyone, but we managed to stop them. He shook his head solemnly, then broke into a wide grin. "Well, my new friends are safe and strong, and beat bad guys," he said cheerfully. Keenan smiled back. "Frank, we want you to have the captain's room. You're in charge here until we return." Frank's face lit up with pride. "Frank will take care of the mess and make sure place is safe." With that he turned and excitedly walked off. Keenan called after him, "Only let us or our friends through, okay?" "Okay," Frank shouted, disappearing around a corner. "We should have asked where the other tunnel leads," I muttered, wincing as I stretched, trying to loosen up my stiff muscles. "They had to get out somehow," Keenan said. "Hopefully it leads somewhere near Grissom." We turned and started down the tunnel. As we pressed forward, the faint sound of waves crashing against the rocks reached our ears, distant, rhythmic, like a heartbeat calling us home. We exchanged hopeful glances and quickened our pace. Soon we emerged into a hidden cove where the ocean lapped against dark stones. The air was thick with a salty tang of sea spray. Above us the sky was painted in soft oranges and golds, the sun hovering near horizon like a watchful eye. Wait, I said, stopping. Is the sun going down or coming up? We stepped further out and to our surprise spotted Grissom Harbor in the distance to the north. That means, I said, turning to Keenan, we were in there for nearly a full day. Or a full day and night, Keenan added wryly. I hate caves, Rieger muttered. Keenan and I couldn't help but laugh, though the motion sent sharp jabs of pain through our sides, quickly silencing us. Still grinning, we began the long walk towards town. By the time we reached Grissom Harbor, the sun had fully risen and its warmth felt glorious on our cold, aching bodies. The town looked unchanged, quiet, familiar, almost surreal after what we'd endured. We headed straight for the inn, where Grog met us at the door. He took one look at us, battered, bruised, exhausted, and without a word turned and disappeared into the kitchen. We collapsed into chairs at the table, completely drained. Moments later, Grog returned with mugs of mead, 3 steaming bowls of hog soup, and fresh bread. He sat across from us silently, watching as we devoured every bite. 5 minutes later, Throm and Gam entered the inn, having heard we were back, and joined us at a table. They waited patiently while we ate. Each of us had multiple servings. It was without question the best soup I'd ever tasted. When we finally leaned back, full and content, we exchanged a look that said everything without a word. The dwarves seemed to understand. Grog stood, locked the inn's front door, and flipped the sign to closed. Returning to the table, he sat down and said, Now, from the start. You walked through the mirror. What happened next? We glanced at one another, then began to recount the entire ordeal, taking turns filling in the details. My uncles listened carefully, asking the occasional question for clarity. When we got to the part about the bumbling gnome, Gam chuckled, and even Grog cracked a rare smile. But Throm frowned, his expression shadowed with concern. You 3 are the luckiest group I've ever seen, he said, shaking his head. But luck like that doesn't last forever. We shifted uneasily, knowing full well the story was only going to get harder to believe. When we described the moment the massive demon stepped through the portal, silence fell over the room. You could have heard a leaf hit the floor. Then Keita repeated what he told the demon. Grog jumped to his feet. By my beard, you told him that, you bugger? He roared with laughter. This one's got some brass on him. I would have paid good coin to see his face when you said that. Still chuckling, he sat back down. Throm and Gam allowed faint smiles, but their focus remained sharp as we continued. When we described being thrown against the wall, Grog glanced at the shield resting beside Keenan and barked, Hey, you silent cretin, why didn't you help them out? At that moment, Keenan and I both remembered Merrick. To everyone's shock, the sentient shield spoke aloud. The moment you stepped into the room, a suppression field activated, Merrick said, his voice low and edged with regret. We listened in stunned silence as he continued. No magic could function in there, none except perhaps the most basic healing touch. I couldn't speak, couldn't draw on my energy, couldn't even see. I was completely cut off. I've never experienced anything like it. He sighed, the sound heavy with sorrow. I'm only just now regaining my voice. It's been returning slowly since we left the cave. Well, that's odd, Throm said, stroking his beard. I don't think I've ever encountered a suppression field that strong before. Okay, so how did you beat him, then? Gam asked, leaning forward with interest. After he knocked you into the wall. We exchanged uneasy glances, fidgeting in our seats. Finally, I sighed and admitted, we didn't. What do you mean you didn't? Grog asked, confused. Throm's expression turned grim. They didn't beat him, they lost. Our heads dropped under the weight of his words. But how? Grog pressed. How are you here, then, eh? We don't know, Rieger said quietly. He spared you? Gam asked incredulously. No, Keenan said firmly. Well, then how? Grog began, but I cut him off. When we woke up, he was frozen solid, I said. We don't know what happened. The dwarves paled, glancing at one another with a strange mix of dread and awe. Even Throm leaned forward in his chair, his normally stoic expression cracking with curiosity. What do you mean, frozen solid? He asked. I mean exactly that, I replied. Frozen, completely. And he had a look of pure terror on his face. Suddenly the 3 dwarves jumped up and cheered, starting us so badly that Rieger nearly spilled his drink. We exchanged wary glances, unsure if they'd lost their minds or if we'd missed something crucial. But after a moment of raucous celebration, fists pounding the table, mugs sloshing, and Grog letting out a war cry that rattled the rafters, they settled down again, breathless and grinning. Can you take us there? Gam asked, eyes gleaming like a child who'd just been promised a new toy. Right now? I asked, stunned. Yes, he said, barely containing his excitement. Throm stepped in, eyeing our battered and exhausted forms. Gam, maybe let them rest first. I could go scout it out myself, Grog offered, already half standing. No, we all said in unison. You'll hurt Frank, I added quickly. The troll? Grog added, frowning. Yes, Keenan said. He's our friend. Gam raised an eyebrow. A troll. A friend. Trolls aren't exactly known for companionship. We should probably kill him for safety. Our reactions were so serious and immediate, Rieger's hand tightening on his knife belt, Keenan's jaw clenching, my glare sharp enough to cut, that the dwarves hesitated. After a tense pause, they backed off, and Grog reluctantly agreed to wait until we had rested. Oh, Keenan said suddenly, reaching into his pouch, I almost forgot. He pulled out several small black stones we'd found and placed them on the table. Gam snatched them up quickly, slipping them into his pocket without a word. To our surprise, he didn't explain a thing. Uncle, I said, eyeing him, this is important. We need to know what those stones are. Gam exchanged a look with the others, then nodded. But not here, he said quietly. Somewhere safer. The three of us exchanged curious looks, but were too tired to argue. Our bodies ached, our minds buzzed with unanswered questions, and the weight of the day pressed down like a mountain. We agreed to rest only until after lunch, then make plans to return to the cave. Dragging ourselves to bed, I lay down, but the image of Narathor's frozen face stayed with me, locked in terror, eyes wide, mouth twisted in a silent scream. And the way the dwarves had reacted to hearing he was frozen, it was almost more thrilling to them than the fact we'd survived. I let out a soft chuckle as I fell asleep. A knock at the door dragged me from deep sleep. Moments later, Grog burst in, grinning like a boy on a festival morning. Come on, boy, daylight's burning. You're killing me, I groaned, sitting up slowly. I stretched and winced. Keenan's healing had done wonders, but I was still sore in places I didn't know I had. Yeah, Grog said. We're all ready to go. You're the last one, as usual. Shaking my head and smiling, I got dressed in fresh clothes they'd brought from home and headed downstairs. The three dwarves were already geared up, packs on their backs and weapons in hand, grinning like kids before an adventure. Our gear was laid out and ready. I chuckled, grabbing the new sword Throm had brought for me. Keenan and Rieger smiled as we stepped out together and made our way to Wilhelm's house. When we arrived, Gam headed straight for the mirror. We need to move this somewhere safer, he said thoughtfully. Agreed, Throm added. Keenan gave him a crooked grin. Paladins lead the way, he said, stepping through the mirror. Throm chuckled and followed. One by one, we all passed through, emerging in the same section of the cave as before. The air was cool and damp, the stone walls glistening with moisture. The memory of our last passage through here clung to us like mist. We warned the dwarves about the water, but we made it through the hallways without incident. As we walked, Throm slowed, running his fingers along the smooth stone walls, a thoughtful look on his face. I wonder, he murmured. Wonder what? I asked. He smiled faintly. There was a city once, partially built underground south of Grissom. This stonework looks like it might be part of it, but, he added, that's a story for another day. Before we could ask more, we heard the thudding of heavy footsteps echoing through the hall. We exchanged amused glances and warned the dwarves to stand back as they instinctively reached for their weapons. Frank came stomping around the corner, his face twisted into a scowl. But when he saw us, his expression immediately brightened. Friends! Ha! You back soon, he bellowed happily. Don't worry, Frank cleaned up. No more stinky dead guys. Then his eyes landed on the dwarves. His smile vanished. He pulled out his club and raised it high. Look out, friends, he shouted. Those enemy, evil dwarves, they kill children and eat them. Keenan quickly stepped between Frank and the dwarves. Wait, he yelled. Frank froze mid-swing, blinking in surprise. Keenan approached slowly and whispered, I've been turning the dwarves to our side to fight the bad guys. Frank squinted at the dwarves. Really? Yes, really, Keenan said with a nod. Those three, 100% good now. Frank stared at them blankly for a long moment. So they friends too? Keenan considered, then nodded. Yeah, they are. Frank thought it over. Then at last he nodded. Okay, more new friends. But don't hurt old friends or I will have to bonk you. Grog chuckled. By the mountain. Gam smirked. Well, now I've seen everything. Throm, shaking his head, mouthed, Eat children? Before leaning toward them, lowering his voice. There's no evil in him. I've never seen that before. We introduced the dwarves to Frank properly, letting him shake their hands and hearing him explain his new cleaning system, which mostly involved throwing bones into a pit and stomping on them until they were not gross anymore. Then we continued to the large chamber. Together we opened the door. There, still frozen solid in the center of the room, stood the massive demon. Frank looked in and gasped, his face contorting in horror. "No!" he cried out. "He hurts me!" He turned and ran. Startled, we looked at one another. Keenan sighed. "I'll go talk to him," he said, and left the room. The rest of us stepped inside, staring in disbelief. Throm immediately approached the demon, inspecting its icy form with a craftsman's eye. He circled slowly, fingers brushing the frost, studying the frozen expression locked in terror. The silence in the chamber was thick, reverent. "You're the only one who would know," Gam said, watching him closely. Grog and Gam exchanged glances, silently waiting for Throm's verdict. After a long pause, he smiled. "Yes," he said simply. Grog and Gam clasped hands, grinning like boys who had just uncovered a long-lost treasure. "Ha ha, that's great news," Grog exclaimed. Gam rubbed his hands together with a grin and gave his signature, "Good, good." "How do we find him?" Grog asked, his eyes still fixed on the frozen form. "He'll reveal himself when he's ready," Gam replied. "I'm just glad he's here somewhere, especially if they're coming back." He nodded toward the demon, his tone darkening. Gam turned to Throm. "Should we crack him?" "Wait, crack him," I finally spoke, having remained silent till now. Gam began excitedly. "There's a spot that—" He trailed off, glancing at the others, his tone turned deadly serious. "We can't say more without permission," he said firmly. "He's a dwarf in my book," Grog grumbled. "Yes, but you're not the king," Throm replied. Gam sighed, then looked at Throm. "But you could—" He hesitated, then said, "Short answer, shatter him, but we can't explain further." Throm crouched, examining the base of the frozen demon. After a moment he smiled. "Found it," he said. Just then Keenan returned with Frank. The troll looked frightened but determined, tears streaking his cheeks as he tried to appear brave. His massive hands trembled slightly, and his eyes darted around the chamber like a cornered animal. I watched him, thinking he must still be a child, or at least stuck in a child's mind. As if reading my thoughts, Rieger muttered, "I'd put him in what you humans would call his teens." I smiled. "Thanks, you old mind reader." Rieger chuckled. "Learn to stop announcing your thoughts with your face." "Okay, Mr. Insightful," I replied with mock indignation. Keenan spoke in a low voice. He was tortured by the demons when he was young. They killed his family. The captain probably kept him around because he thought Frank was entertaining. At that point, my blood boiled. The image of all the kind creatures that demons had hurt or killed flooded my mind. The weight of it pressed against my chest like a stone. Keenan looked back at Frank and said gently, "See, Frank, we stopped him. He can't hurt you any more." Frank took a hesitant step toward the room, his movements uncertain, swaying as if dodging blows only he could see. He was clearly reliving something awful, his breast shallow, his eyes wide. Then, in a rare show of emotion, Throm stepped forward. He cast a spell, soft and golden, and stood beside Frank, whispering something in his ear. None of us could hear what he said, but Frank's eyes widened. "Really?" he said softly. Throm smiled warmly. "Really." Frank straightened up, wiped a tear from his eye, and tightened his grip on his massive club. Brimming with new courage, he said, "I remember you. What you did to my family." He paused, glancing at Throm, who gave him an encouraging nod. Frank turned back toward the demon and said with conviction, "Frank gonna bonk you now." We couldn't help but smile. Frank walked to the spot Throm had pointed out earlier, set the end of his club down briefly, then turned to beam at us with childlike excitement. "You are best friends," he said. Then with a mighty swing, he brought the club down hard. The impact cracked through the chamber like thunder. The demon shattered into 1,000 icy shards, each one catching the torchlight like a falling star. Frank jumped up triumphant. "You see? You helped Frank be strong." We all laughed, the tension breaking at last. The sound echoed through the chamber. After a few moments of celebration, we gave my uncles a quick tour of the remaining area. The halls felt less haunted now, and shadows less sharp. Before we left, Throm collected the last 2 orbs still humming with energy, then smashed them on the ground, releasing the souls trapped inside. Frank agreed to stay behind and protect the cave. He was so happy to have defeated his enemy, and we could see the pride in his eyes as he stood tall, guarding the place like a knight before a sacred tomb. We left the tunnels behind, and the walk back was silent. Each of us was lost in thought, replaying everything we'd witnessed. The wind whispered through the trees, and the crunch of our boots on the ground was the only sound when we arrived at the city. Throm and Gam looked at us, saying they had an idea for an underground chamber and needed to discuss it. "We'll meet you at the inn shortly," Throm promised. Keenan excused himself too, saying he had something to check on. He left with a brief, reassuring smile. Rieger and I headed to the inn, where we were greeted by Rosalind. She often helped my uncle run the place. A sweet freckled girl with light blonde hair, inquisitive brown eyes, and a soft smile. She was our age, grown up watching us get into trouble. She used to joke we'd either become great men or die before we had the chance. Rosalind loved to read. In the evenings, she'd sometimes read aloud to the patrons, her gentle voice lulling them to sleep. Grog always complained. It cost him profits, but we knew he secretly loved it. Rieger and I took our usual corner seats with drinks in hand, letting the warmth of the inn and the comfort of routine settle around us. The fire crackled, the scent of bread and roasted meat drifted from the kitchen. For a moment, it felt like the world had righted itself. After a while, Keenan returned, and we asked if everything was okay. He just smiled and nodded. I was about to press him further when my three uncles entered the inn. Their faces were serious. Throm stepped forward. "This is very important," he said gravely, "but it's not a decision you can take lightly. If you agree, there's no turning back. What we're about to ask of you may cost you your life." We exchanged stunned, uncertain glances. Throm continued, his voice heavy. "We'd like to take you to the king under the mountain."